Hello, philosophy students. So wonderful and charming to be here via distance and the interwebs, and hopefully try to get some things done. Maybe we'll learn a few things. I will try to post some helpful links to maybe augment a few of the things I talk about. I'm going to do this in chunks. So what I have for you today is Renaissance philosophy, which means the first little bit I'm going to talk about is the historical context behind the Renaissance and what gave rise to the philosophy of the day. So, in beginning the historical talk about Renaissance philosophy, let's talk a little bit about what's going on during the Renaissance. So we can't really talk about the Renaissance without backing up a little bit. One of the last things we talked about before break was about medieval philosophy. We talked about Aquinas, we talked about Wycliffe, we talked about William of Ockham and Occam's razor, and now we are transferring some of the previous information into this new historical period called the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a French word meaning rebirth. However, the Renaissance did not actually begin in France. It began in Italy, and specifically it began in Florence, Italy. It is said to have begun in the city of Florence when an artist, a painter, an architect named Giotto, who is one of the earliest known Renaissance painters. If you've ever had a chance to visit one of these museums in Europe, of course some of the American museums have some Renaissance works, but if you look at these really early Renaissance works before our Ninja Turtle names, you have Giotto, who is trying to make paintings with forced perspective. Of course, everybody looks incredibly stiff, almost statuesque in his paintings, but to his credit, he's the first guy to come along in a very, very long time to really try to revolutionize art. And what is marked as the beginning of the Renaissance period is the construction of a tower that he designed next to the cathedral in Florence. Let's see here. I do have a picture. Oh, well, you don't need to do that right now, do you? Yes, let's go ahead and do it because it's the internet. We can totally work on that. We have... I know, this is exactly what you wanted to be held hostage for my vacation pictures, didn't you? Dun dun dun. Dun dun dun. That's right. I went to Italy in 2012. I think I went again in 2014. It's the last time I went that way. It might be the last time in a while, bearing on how things are going right now. Hopefully everyone gets over that and we're able to recover decently. Let's see here. I don't feel like this is the correct picture. If it isn't, we'll just move on. Well, that's moving up. We'll talk a little bit more about the Renaissance. The Renaissance has several different causes, and one of the main causes of the Renaissance, or factors and getting from that period of the Middle Ages, is one, feudalism goes bye-bye. Not entirely, but it gives way to the middle class. And part of that is because of something called the Black Death. Now, these are not something I include here on the slide. I just want to give you a little bit of that background. The Black Death is the bubonic plague, something we all have probably a little bit more in common right now than what other previous classes have had to endure. But the idea of a plague sweeping across an entire continent, or continents back then, just like it is now, pandemic, right? This virus, this actually was a bacteria that swept across Europe. It caused a lot of these laborers to die. And so what happened is labor became a premium, and all these rich people who were fat and happy before that are no longer able to find people to work their farms, and so they're no longer quite as rich and happy as they used to be. This gave rise to the middle class. You have something developing in Northern Europe called the Hanseatic League, which is basically a trade guild. People who are skilled tradesmen and merchants and things like that are coming together and forming their own, basically, government there in the Netherlands, which is going to be a very, very important reason as to why the Netherlands is going to be a little bit more forward-thinking later on. So that's one of the reasons, is the rise of the middle class and the lessening of the stranglehold of the aristocracy and feudalism. But also, in the 15th century, you had the fall of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire that was based in the city of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul today. They were invaded by the Ottoman Turks, and the Byzantine Empire had gone up and down for a number of centuries. They were even sacked by the city of Venice on a quote-unquote crusade that they never got to the Holy Land. They just sort of sat there and sacked the place and left. Okay, so what's the big deal with why this would help bring about the Renaissance as well? Well, it goes back to when we're talking about like the Dark Ages and the Carolingian Renaissance. People were sort of breaking off. They're starting to be more literate. They are starting to be more considerate of learning and what came before them and philosophy, but always in a religious context. So when the Byzantine Empire fell, you had a large number of refugees who were fleeing Istanbul and the Byzantine Empire, Greece, and surrounding areas, who were very, very learned, literate people who have fled the Ottoman Muslim Turks and going into Europe, and they're bringing their knowledge with them. So that helps bring about this Renaissance as well. Of course, one of the main places they go to is Italy, which is going to, fuel the spread from Italy northward, especially, because that's kind of how it goes. It goes from Italy to the north and sort of culminates with England, the English Renaissance. Let's see here. Let's talk about, besides Giotto and the influx of course, the Byzantine Empire falls after Giotto's lifetime, so all of these things are sort of happening at one time. The reason why it's called rebirth is because it's a rebirth in classical knowledge. That is, all things Greek, all things Roman. They're now very, very cool. You want to go and you want to study Cicero. You want to study Lucretius. You want to study Homer. You want to study Plato. And we're sort of getting out of that Aquinian frame of mind where we just want to talk about how terrible of things we are. I have this is Strasbourg Cathedral. These cathedrals, these Gothic cathedrals, which were actually constructed post-Carolingian Renaissance, they were all meant to make you feel incredibly bad about yourself. To like if you think of the Disney Hercules, we are worms. That's what these cathedrals were meant to make you feel about yourself, to make you think that you're deserving of God's grace, or undeserving of God's grace, I should say, but yet he does anyway. That's very much in line with medieval thinking. However, when it comes on to like the Notre Dame in Paris, which unfortunately, you had the fire last year, but before that, Notre Dame was coming in the later end of that, and you could see a shift in no longer trying to make us feel shame and sorrow for ourselves. But Notre Dame was meant to be, free and beautiful and inspiring, and not quite to the same extent. So rebirth, by studying the Greeks and the Romans, they're trying to get back in touch with this idea of humanity, which I have down here in this word, humanitas, which is the Latin word for humanity. Of course, that's what we refer to as the collection of human beings. So he's like, humanity, like humanity's in some trouble right now. However, we also use the word humanity to talk about what's best in ourselves. If you have a dog or a cat that you find in the street, you might take them to the humane society. Why? Because humane is something good. You try to treat them well. It's like a no-kill shelter. If you were being humane to other people at the grocery stores these days, that might mean you're only buying one package of toilet paper instead of buying up the entire pallet of toilet paper, whatever. So yeah, humanitas. It's all about what was best within ourselves. So this here is from Michelangelo's sculpture called David, the biblical character. It's a colossal figure. It has its own little sort of museum in Florence to this day, and people go and stand in line to go see this big statue of David. But it's all about looking at the human form and no longer feeling bad about ourselves. So what does humanitas do? It gives rise to humanism. Not to say that secular humanism, that's going to come later. Secular humanism means outside of the church. This, however, is humanism within the church. So, with humanism, it was all about, okay, what's best about humanity? What are our virtues? Let's try to educate ourselves, make sure we can read, and of course, encourage virtuous living. Humanism in the Renaissance had much in common with Stoicism, in that the philosophy they wanted to look at was Stoic philosophy. It's the Greek and the Roman stuff, right? They wanted to have philosophy that helped them live a better life. So, consequently, it caused them to reject scholasticism. This was meant to reinvigorate themselves in terms of their approach towards learning logic and studying ethics. And we're not only just doing philosophy, but we're also talking about grammar and, oh my God, reading and writing, history, what all the stuff that came before, poetry, music. And of course, we actually, if you have any friends who are musicians or have gone to school for music, it's right about the time of the Renaissance where there is a shift in how music was made and annotated back then. Okay, what else is going on by the time we get to the Renaissance? We have the Byzantine refugees, which I said, and then there's this very specific incident that happened. So the guy named Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla was obviously he's Italian. He's studying a document at the Vatican, and what this document is called the Donation of Constantine. Now, what that means is this: Constantine was an emperor of Rome before the Western Roman Empire fell. And what happened was, according to this letter, this donation, he says by decree that the Bishop of Rome was to be in charge of the Catholic Church, or the universal church of Jesus Christ. And what they were trying to do was establish what we call today the papacy. The Pope. Why is the Pope in charge of the Catholic Church? Well, it has to do with this donation of Constantine. The emperor made it this way, even though there is some biblical precedent, if you're knowledgeable of such thing, about the Peter, disciple of Jesus Christ, having started the church in Rome and become its first bishop, and that's one of the reasons why Constantine said in this supposed letter that he was supposed to, the Bishop of Rome was supposed to be in charge of the church. But what happened is Lorenzo Valla spent days and days and days poring over this donation of Constantine, and he decided that linguistically it didn't fit, as in the language was not appropriate to the time period of Constantine's life. Constantine, you have the Edict of Milan in 313. That is the decree by the emperor that made Christianity legal throughout the Roman Empire. And then later on you have some other Christian things going on, like in 323 and all of that. But the actual... this is also what happens when you try to record these things live. I just lost my train of thought because of somebody was riding a bicycle going by my window here in my office. Okay, anyway, Lorenzo Valla said that's not appropriate to the Latin at the time, and so he's linguistically breaking things down and said, nope, this doesn't work. I mean, if you were to open up a supposed lost book of Shakespeare, and it was written as, almost exactly like a Dan Brown novel, or like J.K. Rowling novel. Even you'd be like, I didn't think that's how they spoke back then. Well, yeah, that's right. That isn't how they spoke back then, and that would in no way be how they wrote anything back then. So he's like, this is a complete fraud. And so what happens is it sort of upends the power of the Pope. And while it's not done yet, that's not going to be, well, I shouldn't say done. The power of the church, the clergy, is not going to be lessened until the Reformation. It does significantly alter how people view the church and how people view the papacy and the clergy. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the actual biggies, your Ninja Turtles. Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, by the way, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Much of the way we had Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, we had Da Vinci. Then Michelangelo. Actually, these guys are contemporaries, although Da Vinci was older. I don't know what happened just there. And then Michelangelo was sort of hung out and taught a younger Raphael. No nunchucks or swords or anything like that. Interesting folk back then. Very, very interesting. We do know quite a bit about these guys outside of their own writings, and yes, they do have writings that survive history, but we also have contemporaries of theirs, because remember, people are more literate in talking about that. And the next guy that we talk about, you see him over here. I'm actually going to stop the video and do it separately, but some of the things going on to pay these guys is what's going to sort of bring Renaissance philosophy to the fore and start talking about it. Now, lastly, what I want to talk about is Petrarch and Boccaccio. So you have a rise in like art, sculpture, architecture, but also in literature and poetry. So one of these works, the Decameron, is about people sitting around during a time of plague and telling each other these dirty stories to keep themselves entertained during the plague. So, yeah, before Netflix, that's what they did in times of isolation and plague. There you have it. Okay, so that's my intellectual. This is my background, historical background for Renaissance philosophy, and everybody here on Ford will be broken up in little sections. Bye-bye.